So yesterday I had materials prepared for about 40 minutes, as it turned out. And today I actually have almost as much, but fortunately this time I start off the presentation being aware of the time limit. Just a quick introduction. I've already introduced myself. My writing partner on this, Beata, as you can tell from the surname, is almost related to me. She's my sister-in-law. So I have 3 archaeologists in my family. Two of my brothers studied archaeology, and one of them married an archaeologist. So given that I'm looking at cultural heritage in games, some sort of collaboration sooner or later was almost inevitable, right? So we wanted to write a paper about this game called Echo: Secrets of the Lost Cavern. In one of the previous sessions, I asked the question, what's the point of looking at obscure games? And this is a game that you could also ask the same question about. It's a game from 2005, so it's not current anymore, but it remains interesting because it's one of a very few number of games that are set in the prehistoric era. So we had a look at this game. We investigated the depth and quality of archaeological heritage in it, and also I looked at it in terms of gameplay and world-building methods. So just to briefly summarize what we found, even though it's quite difficult to actually recreate the Paleolithic era because there's so little left of it, this game does a fairly good job of it. It shows both the possibilities and the limitations of these kinds of reconstructions. And of course, it has been partially outdated by the progress of video game technologies, but remains still a very interesting game to look at. There's going to be a couple of slides where I only very briefly address what is on the screen, just because this is just context. If you want to know more, just take a photo of the slides and look it up further. So as some of you are undoubtedly aware of, there's many complex discussions about heritage. What is heritage? How valuable is it? Why is it valuable? Can tangible heritage be looked at without intangible heritage, and so on? So these are all very interesting discussions which we completely ignore here. Because from the archaeological perspective, the fact remains that whatever the discussions may be, it is still valuable to look at archaeological remains of ancient cultures. And I'm pretty sure I would not find any disagreement on that here. Now, the important thing to keep in mind with archaeology is that while it revolves all around tangible items, you cannot dig up a song or a story from the ground. You can dig up you can dig up a clay tablet with a story written on it, but you cannot dig up the story as it was spoken. So archaeology is all about tangible heritage, but that's not really the point of archaeology. The point of archaeology is to use these tangible items to build a sense of the society that was using them, to develop an overall picture of it. And there are many allied sciences that are used to help out in this process. There's amazing things that we can learn from artifacts. I say we, but of course I mean Beata. I'm not an archaeologist. That we can learn from artifacts using physics, chemistry, and also using ethnoarchaeology. So comparing ancient cultures to their nearest equivalent known from modern times. And technological advances keep providing us with new ways of interpreting old data as well, which again makes it very important to conserve the excavated materials. And sometimes, as in the case of the Lascaux caverns, which are a critical part of this presentation, that makes it necessary to actually close off the site, the original site, from any visits or access. The Lascaux caverns had to be closed off because the mold was destroying the ancient paintings in there. And the complexity of the archaeological process is important because there is value in showing this kind of not just the culture, but also explaining how we have come to know these things. So discovery, the process of discovery, can also be a part of the heritage. So the default method of popularizing heritage is basically through the museum. That, of course, also includes serious games and other multimedia. Several examples there for you to look at in your own time. Another way of exploring heritage is through historical fiction, which is basically any work of fiction that tries to some extent to be historical. So typically it tries to have a relatively well-researched non-historical setting, non-fictional setting. The degree to which it will be actually historical will vary. So, historical fiction is going to be anything from a deeply researched novel to the latest Hollywood movie set in the historical era where, the only true thing is maybe the setting or maybe the camels or whatever. Now, historical fiction is problematic normally. It's even more problematic when it's set in prehistory. Because, of course, the whole idea of historical fiction is you do research with historical sources. And there are no historical sources for prehistory. That's why it's called prehistory. So what you find yourself doing a lot more is engaging in speculation. With prehistory, we feel quite confident in saying we know a lot about prehistory, but it's all hypotheses. Some of these are very strong hypotheses, very well backed up by material evidence, but they are still hypotheses. And that means that you very often find yourself making up stuff as you go along. And this is especially the case when you're trying to build a game world where you have to make up a lot more. So there are very few examples of prehistorical fiction, and most of them are actually fairly controversial in one way or another. So here's a couple of different films that have been around. And then for video games, there are two. At least two that I know of so far. So one is the one we're going to be talking about. The other one was Far Cry Primal, which, yes, it tries to be a historical setting, but those of you who have played it know that it's not exactly historical, prehistorical, really. Echo, interestingly, is the only case here of a game where there is no attempt to create any kind of impression of what it was like when different hominid species played out interactions with one another. So here you only have Cro-Magnon men. You don't have Neanderthals or anything else. Very brief summary of the game. It was published in 2005, so it's 13 years old now. It has been republished around 2010 for the iOS, so you can actually get it on the App Store, but only on Apple. And you can also get it on PC through Big Fish Games. So it's a part of a series of adventure games, most of them fairly similar in terms of gameplay. So its innovations were in the setting, not in the gameplay. It was a very typical adventure game of the time, and it's set in the Upper Palaeolithic era, around 17,000 before the present. And it's all around the Lascaux Cave, which has been called the Prehistoric Sistine Chapel because of the number and quality of the cave art that was found inside. One of the interesting things about the project is that when we mention sometimes how nice it would be if game developers collaborated with historians, they very strongly collaborated with a scientific advisor who is one of the longest serving guides in Lascaux and a scholar of prehistory in his own right. One question that always has to be asked when you're looking at a game this old is there any point to it? Obviously, games have advanced quite a lot. Now, of course, if you try to limit yourself to only studying modern games, you can be accused of fetishizing technology. A friend of mine literally got this accusation in their PhD, but that's neither here nor there. Well, my answer is that when we're looking at how games can be applied for heritage, well, obviously we have to look at their visual quality. If we're talking about whether this game could potentially be shown in a museum, it does matter whether it's good enough looking to attract an audience. So with Echo, the good news is that while it doesn't look that great today, it's actually still relatively passable. As you can see from the comparison between Echo and Far Cry Primal, obviously Far Cry Primal looks much better. But because Echo was pre-rendered, its graphics were somewhat better than would have been in a real-time rendered game at the time. Interestingly, because it uses free rotation in mobile cameras, it would be actually a perfect game to convert to VR. Okay, so we played through the game, and it has to be said, puzzle adventure games are really perverse. They they like to challenge the player with really crazy puzzles, so we did not particularly worry about using a walkthrough. Yes, we used a walkthrough. Even then, 4 to 5 hours was the overall gameplay time, and some puzzles required many attempts because they were more action-based. So from the archaeological perspective, what we found was that the game does very strongly try to to faithfully represent present knowledge at this time of Lascaux and the Magdalenian culture that created it. The tools and artifacts available in the game for the most part, reflect the inventories of the time. There are a couple of exceptions. For example, you have a hafted axe at one point, which Beata tells me would not have existed at that time for another 5,000 years or so. And the original cave paintings are very carefully recreated, although you can identify particular pieces, although they're not always in the same spot in the game as they are in the real world. The palette that is used is also generally identical to what cave painters used. Methods of production of artifacts are simplified, but also entirely appropriate. So here's a comparison. That's the original painting from the Lascaux Cave. And here's the same painting that you get to recreate in the game. There's a bit of an irony because in the game you encounter this painting as an old, worn-out piece that you have to restore. And yet, after you restore it, it still looks more worn out than the original that still exists today. So yeah, it's well aligned with facts. There is some elements that are a bit more speculative, like with plant usage. We know a fair amount about plant usage, but we don't know quite everything. Obviously, plants are not something that's well preserved in the archaeological record, but generally they stick within limits of what is reasonable. And the speculation on intangible heritage generally seems to be quite intentionally limited. So for example, you don't really encounter a society in this game. You encounter 3 other characters. There is a convenient excuse that everybody else has gone to some kind of tribal gathering, and that just allows them to avoid all the different things they could make up about how this society worked. On the downside, many of the puzzles in the game are absolutely absurd in the archaeological context. Here's a puzzle where you have to rearrange a bunch of sticks to open a gate. Okay. Moving on. Now, from the game studies perspective, the game world is revealed in 3 different ways. Firstly, you have the whole narrative of the game. Then you have the gameplay mechanics. So you have facts about the game world revealed through the gameplay. And then you have a built-in encyclopedia that provides even more information. So it's a typical coming-of-age story where you are a young hunter who wants to become a painter. Interestingly, you keep a journal, which I'm sure very many people in prehistory did. It's without writing, it would have been quite an interesting challenge. What I found was that the other characters in the game are very static. They're mostly there to just provide dialogue, moving you on with the story. And precisely because they were not willing to speculate too much about society, about customs of the time, I found the game world to be quite cold and unevocative compared to something like Far Cry Primal, where they just go crazy with the prehistoric culture, but it makes it more interesting there. Environmental interactions are also quite limited here, although the background environment allows you to recognize many plants and so on. In terms of the gameplay-based world building, I think some of the inventory manipulation puzzles are really good at showing you how prehistoric craftsmanship looked. So crafting in particular, you craft a number of items here, a spear thrower, a knife, a harpoon, and these are all done relatively convincingly in terms of the methods that would have been used. Other puzzles, on the other hand, as we said before, detract from the game world. Here's a quick comparison between crafting in 2 different games, in Far Cry Primal and Echo. In Echo, you have to choose the right tool, you have to click it on the right part of the piece of the item that you're working on, and you have to do everything in the correct order. In Far Cry, you select the craft button and it's done. So there's no questions about which one actually shows you more about the process as it would have looked. The third way of exploring the culture is through the game Encyclopedia, which progressively gives you more entries over the course of the game. And it's interesting because it tries to be objective and it also is willing to highlight what we don't know. So here's a game that's trying to show a world, and it's also willing to tell you what we don't know about this world. What did we make up here? And it also expands beyond the original period setting. It also tells you about how the cave was discovered in modern times, how it's preserved, and so on. So coming up to the conclusion, this is one of only 2 games set in prehistory, so obviously it's very much worth looking at still. It's actually the only one set in the Paleolithic area because Far Cry Primal is more Mesolithic, or some of it is almost Neolithic, really. Obviously, it was like all games, it's a product of its time. It's constrained by budget, technology, and genre conventions. It's a very classic adventure game, basically. But it still remains a very intriguing experience. Its design could provide a lot of inspiration for modern designs, both VR and cave-based experience. The acronym cave just sounds exactly like something you would do to recreate a prehistoric cave. So we don't really know what kind of impact it had at the time. Presumably amongst the players of adventure games would have contributed somewhat to popularizing this stuff, but we don't know how much. It's interesting also because there was such a strong collaboration with the science community, and it seems that unlike almost all other examples of this kind of collaboration, here the experts were the ones who had the final say. That's not something you normally see. Just one final thing I wanted to highlight. There was an interesting point of contention here between Beata, the archaeologist, and me as the game scholar. So from the archaeological perspective, what makes Echo is good is the fact that it avoids all this unnecessary speculation. What did these people believe? What did they call their gods, or whether they even had gods? Echo avoids going into that kind of stuff. But for me, from a world-building perspective, that's the game's loss. It's unwilling to engage in this kind of speculation, but that means that the world that results is actually less immersive. So that raises a broader disagreement, which we're not going to go into, about accuracy and generally controversies about speculation. And obviously, with the Stone Age, all intangible culture is going to be necessarily speculative and impossible to verify. So the final question we can ask very quickly is, what works best for the popularization of archaeological heritage? And the answer is, it depends. Staying within these kinds of constraints of established knowledge is obviously going to be better if you want to emphasize the methods of discovery, what do we know, when did we find it out, and what we don't know. So you can highlight the unknowns when you're doing a game like Echo. If you choose to go beyond these constraints and do something more like Far Cry Primal, which is completely fiction, well, you make for a more compelling game world, but of course you're also obscuring the unknowns. So video games are tools also like other forms of historical fiction, so you have to choose the right one for the job. And that's it.